Her old Honda died a mile outside town, so she walked the rest of the way, dragging her backpack. She was young, about 25, with panic in her eyes, a stark contrast to his composed calm. She found him outside Henderson's store and blurted out that she was looking for Jacob Cole. He confirmed that was him, but added that tourists weren't welcome. Red Hollow was closed. The stranger's voice trembled as she insisted she wasn't a tourist. She introduced herself as Alara Wainwright and said her family had founded this town. She was a descendant of Ezekiel Wainwright, and they were in terrible danger. Jacob sighed, exhausted. He politely explained that the only trouble here was Red Hollow officially ceasing to exist in 2 months, and advised her to speak to county lawyers about any inheritance. But she wouldn't let go, clutching his sleeve and insisting he didn't understand. Alara explained Red Hollow wasn't a town. It was a lock, a seal. It hadn't been built for lumber, but to keep something in. Jacob Cole believed in things you could measure, weigh, or fix with a wrench. He believed in regulations, in ballistic charts, in the tire pressure of his truck. So Red Hollow, tucked deep in the Montana woods, seemed like just another task on his long to-do list. A ghost town, to officially declare dead. Inventory what was left, file reports, and hand over the land to the U.S. Forest Service. A few months of dusty but straightforward work. A former Army quartermaster, for whom procedural order was religion, and solitude a welcomed perk. He was the perfect candidate. The town lay in a perfectly round valley, like a giant bowl filled with fog and silence. Centuries-old pines pressed so close to the houses it looked like they were holding them in place. The silence wasn't right. Too dense. Too heavy. It wasn't the silence of absence. It was the silence of presence. Jacob blamed the valley's acoustics. The first week, he buried himself in routine, methodically moving from one empty building to the next. The first glitch in his orderly world was minor. A heavy hammer he'd left on the old town hall porch turned up inside on the mayor's desk, though he'd locked the door. Fatigue, he thought. Absent-mindedness. The second glitch was harder to dismiss. Surveying the northern edge of the property, he saw a deer. But it didn't flee. It slowly rose on its hind legs, stood there for a full minute, watching him with an unreadable, almost sentient expression, then calmly dropped back down and disappeared into the woods. Jacob blinked. Altitude sickness? A hallucination? He made a note to check the carbon monoxide levels in his cabin. The day after meeting Alara, his world shattered. He drove to the eastern border, a road he knew by heart. But after 15 minutes, he hit a sheer cliff face that hadn't been there yesterday. It was smooth as glass and cold to the touch. His GPS thought he was in the middle of Lake Michigan. His dashboard compass spun wildly. With a cold knot in his gut, Jacob turned the truck around. The road back was different. The trees had rearranged themselves. Their branches tangled above him into shapes that resembled twisted human forms. He floored the gas, and when he finally saw the familiar spire of the abandoned church, he stumbled out of the cab, gasping. His logical, measurable world was gone. He found Alara in the old library. She sat at a table buried in dusty books. Without looking up, she asked if it had begun. Jacob hoarsely asked what the hell it was. Alara said something was leaking through, unraveling reality, bending it. Her ancestor had written that it didn't think like us, and our physical laws were just polite suggestions it could ignore. Jacob rubbed his face. The army had taught him to face any threat head-on. But how do you fight an enemy that turns your road home into stone? Before he could think, the question spilled out. What do we do? The skeptic in him was dead, crushed under the weight of the impossible. Ilara said they needed Ezekiel's journal. It contained a ritual. Her grandfather said it was hidden in the family estate, in the safest place, by the hearth. The Wainwright Manor stood on a hill, a time-blackened two-story house with a collapsed roof. Inside, time was wrong. One room had fresh wallpaper, another had walls rotted to the studs. The great fireplace was buried in rubble. Ilara muttered that the hearth was safest. Fire purifies. Jacob began tapping the stones, his military training overriding panic. There's a task. There's a solution. He ignored the thickening shadows and the soft whispers coming from the walls. One stone gave way. Behind it, a niche. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, a thick leather-bound tome, Ezekiel Wainwright's journal. They read it by lantern light in the dead silence of the library. The founder described how his expedition stumbled upon a pulsing void that drove half his men mad. It wasn't a creature of flesh, but a flaw in the fabric of reality, a thinking geometry trying to rewrite everything in its image. The ritual was a desperate improvisation, reinforcing the walls of reality around the entity, using the town as an anchor. 4 components were needed, placed at the town's 4 corners. Rusted chains from the old mine, water from the church well, quartz from Eagle's Peak. And lastly, Ilara read with a faltering voice, a voluntary sacrifice. The blood of the keeper on the foundation stone at the town's center. Jacob asked if she was the keeper. Looking into his eyes, she said the keeper was whoever stood with her. By nightfall, the world outside was unraveling. The sky had turned a sickly purple. The forest hummed with a low, vibrating drone that rattled bones. Gathering the components was a trial. The rusted chains seemed to wrap around his legs on their own. The church well held thick black water that reflected alien constellations. Climbing Eagle's Peak, Jacob saw tree trunks bending at impossible angles. They met at the center of town by the wide, flat stone. Jacob shouted over the drone. They had to move out together, place the items and return. Don't stop, no matter what. His path was south. The world had become an impressionist nightmare. Houses melted like wax. Lampposts bowed to him. No monsters attacked him, only memories. He saw comrades who died in Kandahar, heard the screams from that damned firefight. The entity was rifling through his mind, searching for weaknesses. He gritted his teeth, focused on the mission. Discipline was his armor. He reached his spot, a gnarled old oak, placed the quartz, and ran back without looking back. Ilara was already waiting. Her face was ashen. She started to speak of what she'd seen, but Jacob stopped her. They had to finish. He drew his army knife. Ilara held out her hand, palm up. He nodded, cut his palm, then hers. They joined hands, letting their shared blood drip onto the cold stone. Ilara began chanting from the journal. It wasn't a language, it was a sequence of guttural, resonating sounds that caused physical pain. The forest's hum crescendoed. The ground shook. Jacob gripped her shoulders, forcing himself to stare at the stone, at their mingled blood sinking into granite. He poured all his will, all his stubborn faith in order into that moment. And then it ended. A flash of absolute blackness, a silent explosion of void that stole the air from his lungs. Then silence. Earthly, ordinary silence. At dawn, they climbed the hill to the Wainwright estate. The whole valley lay before them. The town looked the same, quiet, abandoned, mournful. But the forest. Around the town, in a perfect 5-mile radius, was a sharp line. Inside, ordinary Montana forest. Outside, nothing. Not scorched earth. Not desert, just nothing. Gray, smooth, featureless. No grass, no stone. A hole in geography, a scar on the world. Alara whispered that it was the echo, the price of sealing it again. She left 2 days later. Her duty was done. Until next time, in 30 years. Jacob stayed. His report to the Forest Service was a masterpiece of forgery. He blamed illegal mining and soil erosion. It was accepted. Red Hollow was forgotten. But Jacob didn't forget. He was no longer a skeptic. He had become something else. A keeper. He no longer believed in things you could measure or weigh. He believed in the lock and the thing that lay inside it. Every evening, he climbed the hill and looked at the gray, lifeless void, at the scar that separated his small, fragile world from madness. And he knew he would stand watch, because some doors must never, ever be opened.